Alfred Stieglitz was an American photographer who worked at the turn of the 20th century. He was instrumental in making the case for photography as a legitimate art form, and he mounted some of the first exhibitions of photographs shown alongside paintings and sculpture. Yet he is perhaps best known for being the husband and lifelong friend of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. In 1893, Stieglitz took a photograph in New York City on a blustery winter day. I'm going to spend some time visualizing this photograph with you to help you think about how to apply figurative language and the senses in essays. Stieglitz named this particular photograph the Terminal. It was taken at the southern end of the Harlem streetcar line in front of an old post office close to his studio. In the foreground, a driver is wearing a rubber coat and is watering down his sweaty horses after a long day of pulling the streetcar up and down Fifth Avenue. Due to the extreme cold, the water steams off the animals, an element that Stieglitz often exploited. Snow, rain, and mist were a natural way for him to soften and romanticize the harshness of his urban scenes. Stieglitz took this picture using a brand new handheld camera. Unlike his older camera that required a tripod, this one gave him the freedom to knock about New York, capturing scenes of the ever-changing and dynamic street life around him. The photograph is indicative of a radical transformation in how American art photographers started using their medium. They were turning away from stilted, painterly prints of highbrow subjects at the end of the 19th century and towards images that captured the movement and the surprises of everyday life. Today's practice of photo walking, which is just that, walking around with a camera in your hand, taking pictures of anything that interests you, is indebted to the work of Stieglitz. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about the Terminal, I'm going to give you a writing exercise that might seem a little strange at first, but the directions are simple. If you will look carefully at this photograph of the Terminal, and you can easily find a copy for yourself online, imagine yourself walking straight into it. That's right, step into the image as if you were Stieglitz himself, your teeth chattering on a street corner, holding your camera and watching this winter scene. Now, once you're inside the image, the street should become three-dimensional, extending in 360 degrees all the way around you. Look to your left. Look to your right. Take a glance at what's above you. Pay attention to what you're standing on. What are you wearing? What are you holding? Who's nearby? Who's far away? And even though it might be 95 degrees in the shade where you are in the actual world, try to experience the bitter wind and the crisp air as if you were back inside 1893 in the chilly heart of a Manhattan on a winter afternoon. Now, get out a piece of paper or your preferred electronic device and take some notes. I want you to pay close attention to all of your body's senses, the ones other than sight, and focus on each one in turn. Don't worry, we're going to return to sight eventually. Let's start with what you feel in this place. And as you consider what you're feeling, make sure to remember that your entire body is covered with skin, not just your hands and face. Take a moment to reflect on what you're touching, on the textures that surround you. What do your earlobes feel like? How about your elbows? What about your ankles and your lips? Wake up your entire body and pay attention to what it's telling you. Okay, now switch gears. Think about what you hear on Fifth Avenue. Are they loud sounds or soft ones? Repeated or random? Pleasing hums and melodies or jarring thuds and clatters? Are the sounds unusual or perhaps unknown to you? Or have you heard these noises many, many times before? Then change again. This time think about smells and tastes together, since these two senses are closely related. Take a sniff of the air. What do you smell? Harsh smells or sweet ones? Strong or subtle? Enjoyable scents or wretched turnoffs? And ask yourself, what do you taste? Even if you're not eating anything, although you certainly could be, Your mouth always has some kind of a taste to it. As Walt Whitman once said, it's possible to taste the atmosphere, even though it has no smell. As Whitman put it, it is in my mouth forever. So try to taste the atmosphere of this scene and record what flavors it offers. And then, after you've taken some time to make notes on the sounds, smells, textures, and tastes that you're experiencing inside of this photograph, I'm going to ask you to turn your attention back to what you're seeing, to your sense of sight. But instead of having you describe the wintry environment in minute detail, I want you to draw analogies between what you're looking at and something else that it reminds you of. For instance, to me, the shape of the driver's rubber hat resembles a mushroom. So look for shapes, shadows, and angles, and think of other items that remind you of these things. Maybe the steam resembles baking flour that billows around you when you make bread. Or that handle at the top of the shovel, it might look like a wide smile. The important thing is to compare elements within this photograph to other objects or to other ideas that are not physically present. Once you come up with a few analogies, I'd like you to write a short paragraph in which you describe being inside this photograph, using your notes as a guide. Make sure to pull at least one example from each of your senses and use at least two of the analogies that you've come up with. Go ahead and use the first-person point of view and write in the present tense to give your experience a kind of immediacy. And finally, when you're done with this paragraph, take a phrase or a single word out of your writing and use that as your title, as a theme or focus for this experience. Now, I urge you to write this paragraph before continuing on with this lecture, since I'm about to tell you what I did myself. I don't want my approach to influence yours. Ready for me to continue? Okay, here we go. When I wrote this exercise, here's the paragraph that I came up with. Spring. A hard January, and the city has tucked itself up like a startled turtle. It's cold, so cold that as I stand on this snowy salt and pepper street, steam billows out from a pair of exhausted streetcar horses, their hot hides watered back to cool, then cold, by a man in a mushroom-shaped hat, the only plant-like thing anywhere. My eyelashes are stiff. My fingertips tingle. Inside my coat, I feel the height of summer. My blouse is sodden from the sweat of so many layers. Sweater, jacket, coat, scarf, hat, mittens, and double socks and thick boots. The snow is as dead as the frozen air, and my mouth tastes of metal and grease. I would give much for spring. By their very nature, photographs bring the dead back to life, although whatever is represented in a photograph has already happened and cannot take place again. Each time we look at that image, the moment returns. When I glance at a picture of my Uncle Donald on my bookshelf, a man who died years ago, and I see him holding me on the day of my christening, I think to myself, there's my Uncle Donald, my godfather. I don't think there's a chemical representation of my Uncle Donald that leads me to remember the way he looked. Photographs skim the real, and they always exist in the present tense. Writing essays that engage a reader's senses also creates the experience of a present tense reality within the photographic chamber of the mind. In engaging the body's senses within the scene of the terminal, a body's tastes and smells, what it hears and what it can touch, the photographer's image becomes solid with the weight and heft of its materiality. The scene is no longer a thin coat of chemicals on paper or of pixels on a screen. Instead, the hot horses and the streetcar driver, along with the ice and snow, the drab city buildings, become embodied. They now seem palpable and real. And here's the main gift of sense-based writing for an essayist. It brings your essays to life. Even though written words are only black marks against a white background, nothing but a symbolic system, a series of ideas, a reader's body is affected once you evoke taste, touch, smell, sight, and sound through your words. Through the use of the body's senses, the reader's reality is changed. Drawing on descriptions of the senses is one kind of rhetorical imagery. In the late 12th century, when the term imagery started to circulate among Anglo-Norman and French speakers, it meant any kind of work in a solid or flat form that stood in for real-world objects, people, or landscapes. As the meaning of imagery shifted and changed over the centuries, however, it evolved to mean the making or creation of any visual images: photographic, filmed, digital, painted, drawn, or carved. It also meant pictures of the mind and, of course, written representations. For essayists, we use the term imagery to mean written or rhetorical images. And as with our exercise using the Alfred Stieglitz photograph, it's important to remember that imagery drawn from language also has strong affinities to imagery formed through the visual arts. It's sometimes assumed that such imagery is only for poets, but rhetorical imagery is utilized by all kinds of writers who produce all kinds of writing. What matters most is this: when a writer turns to imagery, she's interested in getting her reader to re-feel and re-see experience. Imagery is a powerful tool of pathos or emotional appeals, and we essayists must learn to wield it well, even if we might not think of ourselves as poets. In classical rhetoric, imagery comes to us in the form of schemes and tropes. A scheme occurs anytime a writer deviates from the ordinary arrangement of words for the sake of beautiful expression. In turn, a trope is when a writer uses a word or phrase in a sense other than how it's typically applied. So, schemes and tropes are all figures of speech. If you want a detailed description of all of the figures of speech available to writers, I urge you to pick up a copy of Edward Corbett's Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. Corbett covers a range of schemes and tropes, including synecdoche, metonymy, and oxymoron. For our purposes, though, I'm going to focus on two of the most effective kinds of imagery for the essayist: sense-based descriptions and metaphors. Now, we've already touched on how the senses can wake up your essays and make them beat with the blood of a human body. So let's talk about metaphor, which generally speaking means the representation of one thing by another thing. Why should essay writers employ metaphor? Why shouldn't metaphor be left to the poets, the writers we think of as being most interested in figurative language? Because comparing two objects or ideas creates beauty, surprise, and humor within any kind of writing. Metaphor makes essays fresh and evocative, and figurative language is a decisive factor in creating an original voice. Now, in my own writing classes, I don't spend a lot of time distinguishing between metaphors and similes. Yes, my students and I go over the basic differences between the two. A simile compares two things or ideas using like or as, whereas a metaphor claims that one thing is another thing. Just as a quick reminder, when Robbie Burns writes, "Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June," he's using a sentimental simile. On the other hand, when James Wright notes that only after nightfall, little boys lie still awake, wondering, wondering, delicate little boxes of dust, he's employing a provocative metaphor. Despite the distinctions, similes and metaphors both work in the same way, representing one thing by invoking another. And so I find it easier to discuss them together as one of the most effective ways writers have to recreate the mood or attitude of a person, object, or concept. When I asked you to compare aspects of Stieglitz's photograph The Terminal to something else, you were actually creating metaphorical comparisons. The moment you state that one thing or concept is analogous to another thing or concept, either this is that or this is like that, then you're writing metaphor. And yet there's a distinction between good metaphors and not so good ones. In Annie Dillard's Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she writes about visiting the same terrain around Roanoke, Virginia, across 4 different seasons, and what she discovered there. Dillard is an amateur naturalist, poet, fiction writer, and essayist. In a passage from her standalone chapter entitled Seeing, which is the part of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek that I want us to focus on, Dillard decides to stay late at the creek, to watch as twilight descends until she can no longer see much of anything at all. So here's the excerpt. Where Tinker Creek flows under the Sycamore log bridge to the tear-shaped island, it is slow and shallow. At this spot, an astonishing bloom of life supports vast breeding populations of insects, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The night I stayed too late, I was hunched on the log, staring spellbound at spreading, reflecting stains of lilac on the water. A cloud in the sky suddenly lighted, as if turned on by a switch. Its reflection just as suddenly materialized on the water upstream, flat and floating, so that I couldn't see the creek bottom. Downstream, water turtles smooth as beans were gliding down with the current in a series of easy, weightless push-offs as men bound on the moon. I didn't know whether to trace the progress of one turtle I was sure of, or take the chance on seeing a carp, or scan the mudbank in hope of seeing a muskrat, or follow the last of the swallows, who caught at my heart and trailed after it like streamers. But shadows spread and deepened and stayed. After thousands of years, we're still strangers to darkness, aliens in an enemy camp. The fading light gave great suggestion of lurking beings. Things were going on. Tremendous action roiled the water everywhere I look. Big action, inexplicable. Night was knitting over my face an eyeless mask, and I still sat transfixed. At last, I stared upstream where only the deepest violet remained, and out of that violet, a sudden, enormous black body arced over the water. I saw only one ebony fling, a headlong dive to darkness. Then the waters closed, and the lights went out. I walked home in a shivering daze, uphill and down. Later, I lay open-mouthed in bed, my arms flung wide at my sides to steady the whirling darkness. At this latitude, I'm spinning 836 miles an hour around the Earth's axis. In orbit around the sun, I'm moving 64,800 miles an hour. The solar system as a whole, like a merry-go-round unhinged, spins, bobs, and blinks at the speed of 43,200 miles an hour along a course set east of Hercules. Someone has piped, and we are dancing a tarantella until the sweat pours. I open my eyes, and I see dark, muscled forms curl out of the water. I close my eyes, and I see stars. Deep stars giving way to deeper stars bowing to deepest stars at the crown of an infinite cone. Dillard is a metaphor master. For example, when she says the water turtles are smooth as beans and that they glide down with the current in a series of easy, weightless push-offs as men bound on the moon, she employs two intriguing similes in the very same sentence, comparing the turtles to beans and to astronauts. In one way, these similes are, of course, quite distinct. It's unlikely that very many people think of turtles and beans or turtles and astronauts on a regular basis. And yet, the two similes work together to create harmonious and vivid images in the mind's eye. These images are very concrete in how they explain the way water turtles look as they swim downstream. Let me be even more precise about what makes Dillard's metaphorical comparisons so marvelous. Put simply, she adheres to the three main qualities that make for good metaphors. They are fresh, they are concrete, and they are apt. Freshness comes from the surprise. You've probably never looked at a swimming turtle and thought it looked just like a black bean, or watched one push off from a muddy creek bottom and thought of Neil Armstrong leaping gracefully on the surface of the moon. So a good metaphor or simile is one that gets readers to see something in a new way. Yet these comparisons are also highly concrete. Dillard didn't write that the water turtles are bean-like or that they move like they're in outer space. No, she said they are as smooth as beans. So she's evoking tactility and the pleasure of repeated S sounds. And then, when she writes that the turtles travel in the same way that men bound on the moon, once again she links the words through sound, all those repeated N's, and is also precise about how they move in space as they bound along. Again, pretty good metaphorical stuff. Finally, Dillard's metaphorical comparisons are apt. Even though they're fresh and sometimes even startling, they fit the tone and the context of what she's writing about. Readers delight in metaphors and similes when they are perfect for the mood the essayist is trying to create. In this case, a mood of wonder, as well as the desire to see and to know more about Tinker Creek. There are many marvelous metaphorical comparisons in this passage. A cloud in the sky suddenly lighted, as if turned on by a switch. The last of the swallows caught at my heart and trailed it after them like streamers. We're still strangers to darkness, aliens in an enemy camp. Night was knitting over my face an eyeless mask, and someone has piped and we are dancing a tarantella until the sweat pours. In each and every case, these metaphors and similes are fresh, concrete, and appropriate. It's easier to understand what I mean if I revise Dillard's metaphors into a bunch of real clunkers, an exercise I often do with my own writing students. I ask them to ruin the metaphors and similes they find in a piece of writing, to make them as horrid as possible. Some analogies are so cliched that readers no longer even recognize them as metaphoric comparisons at all, such as the heart of the matter or the leg of the table. In the case of Dillard's imagery, if I change a cloud in the sky suddenly lighted, as if turned on by a switch, to a cloud lighted up as bright as day, I've just drained her metaphor of its freshness. One way to avoid cliched comparisons is to ask yourself whether you've heard the analogy before. If the phrase as blank as a blank is easy to fill in, as strong as an ox, as fast as a horse, as happy as a clam, then your comparison isn't going to be either original or smart. To give you another example, I'll change the last of the swallows caught at my heart and trailed it after them like streamers to the swallows caught at my heart like something really long and pretty. Okay, so this time I've stolen away Dillard's concreteness and precision. Bad metaphors often come from overly general comparisons, and sometimes they make for real howlers, such as disease and deprivation stalked the land like two giant stalking things, or her vocabulary was as bad as like whatever. If I revise, night was knitting over my face an eyeless mask, to night knit over my face a black ski mask, turned around backwards like the kind bank robbers use, well, I've destroyed the appropriateness of her figurative language, turning wonder and a little bit of dread into a tone of silliness. Now, if you want to have to get silly, it's easy to turn a good metaphor or simile into a dreadful one by deliberately comparing one thing or idea to another that doesn't fit at all. Some well-known clunkers from the Washington Post's Style Invitational, an invitational to write really, really bad analogies, include: he was as tall as a 6'3" tree. The politician was gone, but unnoticed, like the period after the doctor on a Dr. Pepper can. The little boat gently drifted across the pond, exactly the way a bowling ball wouldn't. And her hair glistened in the rain, like nose hair after a sneeze. With these little gems, it's pretty easy to see why the appropriateness of metaphor really matters. Now, before I move away from Dillard's essay Seeing, I want to point out two more aspects of her writing that make her prose deeply imagistic. First, in addition to fresh, concrete, and apt metaphorical comparisons, Dillard also brings in descriptive details, as well as information from astrophysicists. She tells the reader that At this latitude, I'm spinning 836 miles an hour round the Earth's axis, and that all of us are in orbit around the sun moving 64,800 miles an hour, and that the solar system as a whole spins at the speed of 43,200 miles an hour along a course set east of Hercules. So this is another kind of imagery that comes with descriptive detail, but detail that's not about the senses. Instead, Dillard uses specific and accurate data, yet in quoting such enormous numbers to convey just how fast we're all spinning on the planet all the time across the whole of our lives, she also creates a kind of mental dizziness. So when she lands at her central metaphor within this paragraph, that someone has piped and we are dancing a tarantella until the sweat pours, she's earned it fully. By the way, I should mention, a tarantella is a folk dance. It's a metaphor that brings together her use of scientific data, synthesizing it into a tactile, spinning whole. Okay, finally, I want to point out that Dillard's diction is very, very precise. If readers were offered a list of Dillard's verbs, nouns, and adjectives, and nothing more, they'd still have a pretty vivid sense of what her essay, Seeing, is all about. Instead of using bland verbs, such as sit or walk or look, Dillard brings in stalk, straddle, hunch, stare, spread, deepen, fling, dance, and pour. She also doesn't talk of bugs and birds and mammals. She names them water turtles, carp, and swallows. And then an enormous black body when it's too dark to see anymore. And her adjectives and other descriptors paint mental pictures all by themselves. Tear-shaped, slow and shallow, reflected, flat and floating, weightless, uneasy, enormous, ebony, shivering, breakneck, deep, deeper, and deepest. Dillard understands that the language of the essay is the language of particulars. The American poet Mary Oliver says in her superb book called A Poetry Handbook that, without the particularity of language, poetry might still be wise, but it would surely be pallid and thin. It is the detailed sensory language incorporating images that gives the poem dash and tenderness and authenticity. Oliver points out that when a writer uses the words the apple or the peach, neither the apple nor the peach is a very specific thing, although both are visual and imagistic when compared with an even more general word such as fruit, which is informational only. Oliver says a writer's work becomes more interesting as it gathers particulars, especially sensory details. She explains that when one writes the last apple on the tree or the one small peach as pink as dawn, that writer is beginning to deal with particulars and to develop texture. So to start developing compelling metaphors within your own essays, I suggest that you try the following exercise. Just like when you stepped inside the Stieglitz photograph, select another photograph, one of your own that you'd like to write about. Do choose it with determination and purpose. While the picture you select may be a personal one, it should not just be a snapshot, a back-to-school photo of your kids off an iPhone, or a hasty picture of old high school friends at a reunion. It needs to be a deliberate image, taken with the eye to create art, to represent the beauty and the tragedy of the human through photography. Then, try to write a photo essay based on your selection, limiting yourself to no more than 750 words. This is the standard length of a micro-essay. Pay close attention to the precision of your verbs, nouns, and adjectives. Think about the descriptiveness of your details, including data and other information. Work for freshness in your metaphors and similes, and also concreteness and aptness. And consider the vividness of how you engage the senses, especially smell, taste, touch, and sound. As Mary Oliver says, be as particular as you can be. Don't allow yourself the use of words such as thing, something, or anything. And no matter what your subject is, be it the Vietnam War or Thanksgiving dinner, take care to engage your readers' bodies and imaginations. Allow your readers to feel and absorb your experience right alongside you. Work to write an essay that vibrates with the pulse of life, in all of its sensory and imagistic wonder.